Hello. So I'm trying something different today, which is I'm speaking into a microphone here for one thing. I have this is actually my landlord's microphone, and using a piece of equipment called the Roll and Go mixer, I am able to use this classic Shure SM58 microphone to give myself a better, more professional sound quality while doing this video. So hopefully this will make a generally more pleasing experience and be easier on the ears. I think I was watching. So that's one thing. If you notice, I'm using the microphone here. And so last video I made was an introduction to the square aspect. And so that will save me from having to go into a lot of stuff in this video, and we can just kind of dive right into it. Now, I was kind of looking at the project that I set myself out, and to do a whole video on each one of the combinations of the squares between, to do a square for Scorpio, square Leo, to do a video for Leo, square Taurus, etc. would just be a lot of videos to make, and I can get things done quicker if I organize this into the modalities. So this is going to be a video on the fixed signs. I could have started with the cardinal signs, but I decided to start with the fixed signs. So just to review some of the things that I went over in my last video, there's an idea called being upon the 10th, and it's also the idea of the superior square, and that's that in the square aspect, the square relationship, it's not an even relationship, and I'm making the argument that it's like one of these signs is putting a demand on the other sign. And it's not an easy demand to fulfill, and that is kind of like the source of the conflict or the tension that we would associate with the square, and why we associate the square with being of the nature of Mars, because it's sort of like a fight or a struggle to try to fulfill the demand that's being placed on one sign by the other. So with that in mind is kind of the theory that I'm going at this with. I'm going to go and look at each of the fixed squares here. So, first one I'm going to do is the square between Leo and Scorpio. Now, with Leo and Scorpio, Leo is in the superior position. This is because from Leo to get to Scorpio, it's only a few signs, but from Scorpio to get to Leo, it has to go through a much larger part of the zodiac for a planet in Scorpio to wind up back in Leo. So it's got it's more of a demanding journey, or demanding part, more of the demand is being placed on Scorpio here, and that's kind of this. I don't know if you, we'll just try to, using that theory, let's try to explore what that could mean with these two signs. Okay, so like what do we associate with Leo? We associate, it's a sign that's ruled by the sun. You've got that solar quality that we associate with the hero, or the protagonist, or the leader, or the king, or it's also the king maybe being a more mature or authoritarian kind of thing, whereas it's also this kind of joyous, youthful, kind of a radiant, abundant of youth and playfulness and the sunny day thing and all that, right? It's very yang, boyish, masculine energy in Leo. When it comes to Scorpio, you've got a water sign, which is a feminine sign, which, I mean, we're not really getting so into the, I don't really mean like the boyish, to get too gendered with the boyish versus the feminine or something, but to bring it back into the yang quality versus the yin quality. So right off, there's a pretty strong contrast with the yin and the yang in a square. So part of what the conflict comes in here is that while Leo is more yang and it's more about leading and winning the battle and being the heroic protagonist, Scorpio is more, it's like you got the Halloween thing, right? Which is the fear of loss, which is sort of like being kind of paranoid and overprotective and defensive, and the kind of classic, the self-reflective angst of the broody goth teenager or something is all Scorpio kind of thing, right? And so you can see how these kind of energies automatically are very different. In some way, and there's a kind of a challenge being placed on them. And I think that it's part of what that challenge is in a way it's kind of like what came to mind when I was thinking about this is in Lord of the Rings. If you look at like the third book is called Return of the King, and it's all about the character Aragorn, who is kind of like he was just like a ranger and people didn't know who he was, and he is kind of like this person who's been kind of cast out from his place of being in a position of empowerment into a place where he's kind of like facing, he's getting chased by the Black Riders, and to try to, he's like he's not in an empowered position, but rather he's fending off the ghouls that are at his tail kind of thing, and it's like how do you get from that position where you're kind of disadvantaged and in a kind of not at ease into reclaiming a kind of a position of being back to like a kind of homecoming, return to a position of empowerment or something like that. It's sort of like the redeeming the kind of the lost soul coming back into his or her own power kind of thing. And I think that is kind of maybe a deeper underlying dynamic between the square between Scorpio and Leo. And I think there's possible like problems that could come up with this square is that Scorpio, traditionally speaking, it's a Mars sign. I'm modern astrologers. If you wanted to apply the Pluto thing, there's I'm kind of going more for the Mars, in that Mars is a combative planet. It's the god of war. It's something that is like, if the whole thing is like if the goal of the square is for Scorpio to get to this sort of empowered position of Leo, it's like you got to make sure that you're not using shady, underhanded, dishonest means to get there, basically, right? You got to have integrity and be acting on good ethical standards to get to where you need to go. And I think that the whole thing about Scorpio is that it could be too suspicious, too paranoid, too defensive, and that could like sabotage. That could be seen as being overprotective could be self-sabotaging, basically. If you're trying to be too, if you're too suspicious of your enemies, then you kind of turn into an enemy yourself or something like that. Be interesting to like look at some charts of some famous people to try to see if I can find any examples of the Leo Scorpio square kind of in action, and I don't know if anybody's watching this and you have some good examples of squares that I can look at. I haven't really bothered to try to source that for this talk. I'm just gonna check to see how my my audio is doing here, and then I'm gonna resume with the next one. Okay, so it turns out that the whole time I recorded that first part of it, the microphone was just really a prop. I didn't have the microphone here. Well, I'm going to adjust my volume here. I didn't have the microphone turned right at all, really. So, okay, well. Anyways, continuing on. So the next one we're going to do is Scorpio Aquarius. Let's make sure I got the volume here. Like testing. Hello. Yo, what's up? Is this okay? Scorpio Aquarius. With these two signs, I think it's interesting the way I'm doing this, because we're talking about Scorpio being at a disadvantage before in the square, and now we're looking at what it means for Scorpio to be in the superior position. So what Scorpio is in the superior position to is Aquarius. So if we look at Aquarius, it's generally has to do with this thing about self-sacrifice, right? And I think it's kind of like, it's a bit of an extreme metaphor to use, but I think it fits when you look at the Scorpio square to Aquarius, because there's something to do with Scorpio that has to do with it rules the genitals, and it has something to do with sex and all that kind of thing. There's this, it's apparently in the old courts of different kingdoms and stuff, it was common to have what you'd call, I'm not getting the name right, the eunuch. It's it would be servants to the royal family who have been castrated or sterilized in some way. And this is the whole thing, is that by the fact that you can't reproduce, it means that you're not a threat to the royal bloodline, right? You're not a threat. So you're sacrificing something of yourself so that you're seen to be not you're sacrificing your own manhood, as they would say, so that you're not seen to be a threat to the king, so you're the trusted servant, and you're like the right hand man that can be relied on, or something like that, right? And I think there's something about this that is at the heart of some of these air signs, like Aquarius and Libra, is this sort of self-sacrificing kind of nature. And I think there's when Scorpio comes into it, what I'm remembering is like a lot of talks from Brene Brown, who's a famous Scorpio, and she talks a lot about vulnerability and shame and stuff like that. But one of the things she talks about is that, like, that it's the metaphor of, like, if you're in a an airplane or something like that, they say that in case of an emergency, you put your own oxygen mask on before helping out your person beside you. And the whole thing is that there's a virtue to that sort of higher humanitarian ethical ideal of an improved society that Aquarius tries to strive for. But what we got to be careful not to lose is that we're not self-sacrificing for too much for a higher ideal, that we're not neglecting our own needs and our own we're not basically running ourselves dry, burning ourselves out in the name of some sort of humanitarian higher thing, right? And I think that's part of what Scorpio is all about, is there's a kind of, aside from just being about the fear and about being protected and defensive, Scorpio is really about, it's also about the kind of like needing the desire for what is going to be, I mean, there's a kind of question about like what's a want and what's a need kind of thing. What is a desire and what is what can you do without, and what is something that nourishes and supports and gives you the resources you need. And that's kind of like Scorpio can have problems perhaps with, like, not really nourishing itself with the most high quality nutrients. The Scorpio needs to have a better know what it is that's actually helpful. And I think that could also be, the discerning kind of suspicious, is like, is this really good for me, is like, and trying to maybe too judgy or something like that with the Scorpio or something like that. But ultimately, like, it needs it's out there. It's still very intimately linked in with the desire drive mechanism. And I think the desire basically is for self-sustaining, right? It's and that's kind of like even though Scorpio is seen as this dark thing, it sort of is, it's trying to sustain through the journey through the underworld, sustain through the descent, protect itself against the threats, and stuff like that. And here, I mean, I think the tension between Scorpio and Aquarius is, it's like the threat of too much self-sacrifice, too much selflessness, to the point where even something we would think would be a virtue could become toxic, like a toxic self-sacrifice, basically, if you know what I'm saying. Or like those people who are like over like Gabramante, what he says about like only the good die young or whatever, right? That like what we make out to be a virtue, which would be Aquarius, is so often what's actually killing us, which would be the Scorpio side of it, right? So when you see that kind of tension there, I think that is really highlighted with the Scorpio Aquarius thing. So, and then we get into Aquarius and Taurus. There's something, let's see. I mean, we're already talking about Aquarius, how it was self sacrificing and working towards an ideal, working towards improving something. So that has the edge. Aquarius here has the superior square to Taurus, right? So if you remember how in the oppositions video we're talking about Taurus opposite Scorpio, well, this is the midway point is between that is Aquarius on one side and Leo on the other, forming the square, right? So this corner here between Aquarius and Taurus, it's like I think if Scorpio is about some kind of like facing the fear and the discomfort or the desire or something like that. I think Taurus is about kind of like the appreciation of what is like comfortable and what is supportive. It's sort of like it's kind of like the other side to the Scorpio, which is desiring it. Taurus has it, and it's kind of like if you look at the tarot card for Taurus, there's the Empress, and she's looks like she's hanging out in a pretty luxurious garden, and she's like comfortable, and maybe she's like kind of like fanning herself, and she's like, you know, this very like she looks like she's full and kind of almost maybe she's pregnant. There's a kind of the birthing thing with the Empress, but she's like, you know, feeding herself and nurturing this new life, and a very, you know, and comfortable and that kind of thing. And it gives me the kind of the feeling of like you know, like the nest, right? Like the bird's nest, and they're like incubating eggs and keeping them warm and protected and giving them the support they need and all that kind of thing. And I think if we stay with that kind of metaphor of like incubation and the nest, and I mean, I talked about the nest kind of thing with Cancer, but with that spring into summer thing, there's a kind of like it's like kind of like the earlier stage. Cancer is like more of the later stage of that. Taurus is more of like the earlier stage of kind of germination and incubation and things like that. Whereas Aquarius is more about independence, right? Taurus is more about you're comfortable on the dependency of this stuff that's all supportive and nice and pleasant and all this kind of thing. But Aquarius is more of a challenge because it's kicking the little birdlings out of the nest and like time to learn how to fly so on your own so you can build your own nest kind of thing. I think there's that, and that's kind of like the challenge. I think it's also if you look at what's going on in the world right now, we've got this Uranus and Taurus, and we've got Saturn in Aquarius, right? And that is going to be over the next couple of years. The square there between those two signs is going to be highlighted, especially when we've got this great conjunction with Jupiter and Saturn. I mean, we're getting to like, you know, the modern astrology and all that, but I do factor in these outer planets and try to have a kind of integrative thing. I'm kind of getting off track now, but I think that's one thing to consider perhaps is like the issues of dependency versus the issues of becoming kind of self-sufficient and facing the discomfort of, you know, stepping outside your comfort zone to also deal with perhaps humanitarian issues, right? Because it could be to stay at home in the wealth of the lap of luxury or something, or if you've got a comfortable situation is one thing, but it's kind of like, okay, but like what about all these other, what about the outside world and the problems in our society? And it's like it's not really, there's something they're asking, really basically the self-sacrifice again, asking Taurus to make the sacrifice, right? To like, okay, get off your comfortable couch and go out there and do something to help improve things. And it's not going to be as comfortable as, being surrounded by all these Venusian comforts. You're going to have to learn some Saturnian discipline, to face the challenges, kind of thing. It's so I think that is kind of what you see between the Aquarius Taurus square. I was also thinking, I don't know, I my notes here as I was trying to like sketch out this idea, I was also thinking that if you look at the Aquarius, the tarot cards associated with Aquarius, the major arcana card associated is the Star, which is a woman who is fully nude with two pitchers of water, similar to the Aquarius water pourer, and she's pouring one on the ground and one in the water. And there's just sort of like this, and that's kind of like this giving back to society thing, maybe. It's sort of like, you're not just nurturing your, it's sort of like you're really like kind of trying to give it back to the world in a way, right? But there's something in, I think the symbol of the nudity in the Star is like it's coming to terms with the kind of vulnerability. There's a kind of like with the incubation, what I was saying before with the nest, right? With like the birds sitting on the eggs, it's sort of like, it's like that versus being like you're exposing yourself more to the elements with Aquarius, right? You're more like, and I think that too is like, by putting yourself out there, there's more of a risk, right? There's more of like, if you're not wearing any clothes, maybe all your imperfections are showing, and you can't judge other people because you don't have anything to hide behind, and there's something about that which is, it's kind of like the taking the risk to put yourself out there, really, right? Whereas I think the problem with Taurus in that sense is that it can be too comfortable in all the Venusian garb, right? Like dressing up in beautiful things and treating yourself to all these things which are nice. And it's sort of like, okay, but what happens when you have to expose yourself, right? And to really get in there and do the work or something, right? I think that is another, these are kind of deeper meanings behind these dynamics, right? So this one, we're going to do Taurus and Leo. So in this situation, Leo is in the inferior position, Taurus is in the superior position. So Taurus has the edge on Leo, basically. And I think if we look at the meaning of Leo, let's just go with like the leadership thing for now, right? If we look at Leo and the sun as being a kind of a leadership position, what is ultimately the goal of leadership, right? Like ultimately the goal of leadership is something that's represented by Taurus here. And it's if you're leading a group of people, you're ultimately seeking to provide something for the people. And I think the Venus ruled sign of Taurus here is asking Leo, putting the demand on Leo to provide for it what I would say is the good, the beautiful, and the true, as being these kind of values or ideals that are emphasized by the principles of Taurus, right? That if you're, like, say, if you're a leader and you're providing for a country, right? Then you need to provide like safety, security, access to, food and education. And it's like you want to provide, if you go back to that thing about the incubation and the nurturing, the nesting thing, if you're a leader, it's archetypally on the leader to provide this sort of nurturing position of the feminine, right? The leader might be a masculine position in here, but the fact that it's being squared by Taurus puts that the actual goal of the masculine is to provide something that is feminine. And that could be also seen as the Venusian ideals of like peace, right? Of peace, unity, getting along harmoniously, creating a pleasant situation. Ultimately, we were aiming for something that is, we want to create a society that is as nice and pleasant and Venusian as possible. And so the people that are put in the position of leaders and heroes and whatever, all the protagonists, we want them to try to help us achieve that. Or in our own life and as our own ego, that's ultimately the modus operandi for the ego, is to try to it has a Venusian ideal, because it's like the Venus represents that which is or Taurus, I would say. Venus Taurus is like the nurturing, the sustenance to provide that. Now, I mean, that could play out on many different levels, and I was reflecting on this. I think it's interesting to look at the quality of Earth here, right? Because, well, I think in our culture, we've got a really weird relationship to the Earth, and I think we can look at stuff like our divination systems for maybe hints and clues to what that's all about. And I think it's kind of interesting when you consider that in tarot, the whole suit of the Pentacles is represented by the element of Earth, right? And so there's a deeper mystery to what these pentacles represent, because some people don't use the word pentacles; they might call them coins, right? And in certain of these, certain of the tarot cards here, the pentacles or the coins, it is very much like we're talking about wealth, right? We're talking about even like the 10 of Pentacles sort of references this sort of, in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck anyways, references this kind of like inherited wealth of the generations or something like that. Or if there's other ones that are like charity and poverty and all these things about management of wealth, something to do with the sign of Taurus and pentacles or coins or something like that. Now, I think in our society we've kind of moved away from the fact that like our mode of money or whatever is basically a form of accounting for things, right? It's a fungible mode of transaction, where rather than trading cows for horses, we can trade all sorts of goods and services with each other. And money itself is kind of empty, though. It's kind of more of maybe like you can see that sort of transaction deal making is actually maybe a bit more mercurial. It's a little bit more in the realm of air, perhaps, right? With Gemini or I guess, I mean, Virgo brings that out too, right? But that the actual, I think there's something about Taurus, which is like the bread and butter, basically, right? Which is like we have turned all this into like an abstract accounting system, but I think with the core of it, what really means is like food on the table, basically, right? And it's like when it comes, and this is really, I think, when it comes to the idea of, with Taurus and Leo, there's this big thing between politics and economics, right? Like Leo is politics, Taurus is economics, and economics isn't just about money. It isn't, and it's like, I mean, here in Canada, we live in like a resource kind of economy where politics around resources are a big thing, and it's not just about money, but it's like also, I think we're gonna have to, I live in a green riding, okay. One of the few green ridings in Canada, so like ecology and environmentalism are an important concern, right? And I think when you're talking about the Earth, you're talking about Earth as a element in divination systems or occult philosophy. Earth is a way where you can. It's not a dichotomy between money and resources, right? That it's like you can see that like if you take value from the environment in the forms of resources and then you sell it for wealth, it's like you're, you have to do something to replenish so that it's sustainable, right? I mean, this is all pretty common sense stuff. It's not necessary for me to give a sustainability lecture about all this kind of thing, but I think that perhaps the popularity of occult systems in recent years could be about something of trying to create a new way to conceptualize and look at some of the problems that are facing right now as our society, which is both the economic problem of economic disparity, bank bailouts and all this kind of thing, big government bailouts, the actual practical things of like once people get to a place where they don't have access to food and they don't have access to all these things that actually support why do we put people in government in positions of power anyways, is to help so that we want everybody has their needs met, right? When the needs aren't getting met, then that's then it becomes a revolution or something like that, right? And these kinds of pressures I think are exemplified by the Taurus Leo square particularly, or at least how I'm looking at it in this video. This is what it brings up for me anyways, because there's also the Aquarius Taurus thing, but I think the Aquarius Taurus is more about like Aquarius in a way is more of like the activist, and Leo is more of like the authority in some way. Leo is more of like if you've got like in a position to do leadership, in the opposition to that being Aquarius is like the critics or the activists or something like that. But in a way it's all kind of wrapped up together, right? Like that even somebody like Trump could take on the Make America Great Again, that did a course with Adam or Chuda, who points out that even conservative stuff like Make America Great Again is an Aquarian dream of bringing back this sort of utopian ideal or something like that in their own way, right? And that the Aquarian challenging the established system of the king as Leo, right? Like, and it's kind of funny that Obama has sun in Leo, right? So that like you can see that if Obama is kind of like a Leo character, then Trump is like the Aquarius to Obama's Leo. So now I've gotten. You kind of have to get into this stuff because like the squares kind of like imply the oppositions too, right? I'm kind of going a bit off track because I'm not just doing squares now. Now I'm talking about oppositions and politics and all sorts of things. But there we go. Anyways, right? Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I think I'm going to conclude it here and stay tuned for my other videos on the other squares.